Not my working hat, which was so grody, I had to dispose of it. But this is actually my grandfather's hat,
Wow.
which is still in. It was in a box, so it's in mint condition. It's is Ingrid here?
Is it a
It's a
beaver hat?
it's a beaver. It's a beaver.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, most of my hats have been beavers. The hat on the west.
There was a great thing on NPR, by the way, I think it was yesterday, about this guy who was introducing beavers into Belgium. Um,
Hmm.
and it was very funny. It turned out he did all this work to try and get introduce beavers into Belgium, and then he finally got some beavers that came from Germany, and he was going to introduce them into a French river uh, that would flow into Belgium because the Belgians didn't want them. And then they had when he went to pick up these beavers, he said, "Oh, they're so big." And then the narrator says, after years of fighting to get beavers into Belgium, it turned out this guy had never seen a beaver in his life. And
Wow.
They changed the environment. Um, I had a house in New Hampshire that had a it had an old beaver pond that had gradually become a meadow, very boggy meadow. But anyway, so yeah, so this is a beaver hat, and uh, it's not my original hat, which is long gone. But uh, so I wanted to talk about chimney sweeps and chimney sweeping and the various aspects of that, but also my career as a chimney sweep. So I mean, and I learned a very interesting thing this morning that there is actually a silent movie called "The Miller and the Sweep," where a chimney sweep and a miller are having a fight in front of a windmill, a grist mill, and the miller is holding a bag of flour, and the sweep is holding a bag of soot, and everything gets all mixed up. But I was looking actually for a still black and white photograph from the late 1800s of a sweep and a miller sitting on a cart together, and it's called black and white because the sweep's all black and the miller's all white. But as far as I know, the sweeps have been around since the 1500s when I guess there were mass fires in some European cities, in London in particular, when they outlawed making chimneys out of um, plastered wood, which they used to just build them out of wood and then plaster the wood, which apparently stuck didn't work real well. And so chimney sweeps came into being, and at least in England, I think that on the continent they were earlier. But um, the uh, the other interesting thing about chimney sweeps, especially in Europe, is that they're considered carriers of good luck. And when there are some countries where they will have chimney sweeps come to a wedding because that's supposed to be good luck for the marriage. And there's all kinds of stories about, especially people would tell me when I was working, about their ancestry and what they did as little children when the chimney sweep would come around. So the interesting thing about sweeping in England, in Europe, they for some reason they didn't have this issue, but in England there were the climbing boys, and the climbing boys would be a small child who maybe 7 or 8 years old who was either who was acquired by the master sweep or possibly indentured, or parents who couldn't afford to feed all their children would indenture a small child to a chimney sweep, and they would actually climb up inside
wow.
the flues. And the story goes that there would sometimes be two climbing boys. The one above, who would have a brush and scraper, and the one below, who had pins, so that if the sweep above, who was doing the work, got stuck, the one below would jab him in the bottoms of his feet in order to cause him to do a little bit of extra effort and get himself unstuck, because it would be awkward to have a chimney sweep become stuck in the in the flue. And there is actually a book called Water Babies by Charles Kingsley from the second half of the 1800s in England. And that was a story about Master Sweep and his apprentice coming out to a manor house in the country in the suburbs. And on their way, they see this sort of gypsy woman who nods knowingly to the child, to the climbing boy. And they go in, and the climbing boy starts to work, and he is working away, and he comes down into the wrong flue. He comes down into a fireplace that's in somebody's bedroom, and it's the one of the children of the family, and he looks down, and in the polished brass ash shovel, he sees the reflection of his face, and he's covered with soot and everything, and he cries out, and it wakes up the child, and she starts screaming, and he goes out a window and is running through the countryside, and as he gets into some woods, he sees this old gypsy woman, and he begs her to help him out, and she somehow or other peels away his outer husk, and he dives into the water, and becomes this water sprite. And then he has sort of like a pilgrim's progress of meeting with other creatures in the stream, and ends up going out to sea. But when he gets down to the mouth of the river, he discovers that his master sweep has died, and he's being informed that the master sweep is going to be punished by having to clean out the throat of Mount Vesuvius. And so the boy, whose probable name is probably Tom, it seemed like they were all called Tom, he intercedes for his master sweep. And so instead of going to hell, he just has to do a brief sweep out of Mount Vesuvius. But this became a big thing in England, because there was the conditions of the climbing boys were so wretched that it was actually becoming the impetus for one of the very first social reform movements in England. And they had processions, and the climbing boys would be there. And the climbing boys had barely had any clothes. They were dressed in rags, and they would sleep on sacks of soot, and so they were completely saturated with the soot. And this gave rise to what was called chimney sweep's disease, which was cancer of the scrotum in particular. And it was really not a good thing. And they eventually outlawed having the climbing boys. I think that was in like the 1870s. And so you had to be of a certain age. And like I said, in England, in Europe, they had an apprenticeship program. And the master sweeps, they could use brushes instead of having the climbing boys.
So Douglas, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So it sounds like the climbing boys were doing most of the work. So what was the master sweep's job?
He was hanging out, and he would go into the kitchen, maybe get something to drink, or flirt with the cook. I don't know, and get the money. And he probably was a climbing boy at some point, also. And in Europe, they were considered carriers of good luck. In fact, there is a Hummel figurine um, of a chimney sweep carrying a pig. For some reason, pigs were considered good luck also, or at least maybe it was just pigs that were being carried by chimney sweeps. I don't know, but this was supposed to be a double dose of good luck. The chimney sweep carrying the pig, and I had a situation. I went to visit my parents, and in the process, I went out in my truck and I swept chimneys of friends of the family, and while I was doing that, I was out in a suburban town, and there was a gift shop, and I went in and I was talking to the woman behind the counter, and she looked past me and said, "So what's the good news?" And I turned around, and here was this guy, and he had this big smile on his face. Turned out he was the owner of the shop, and he said, "Well, there's a chimney sweep in the shop. This is great," because was from Yugoslavia, and as a child, that was a thing. Chimney sweeps were good luck, and I had little kids. One time when I was in a neighborhood sweeping the chimney, I was getting my equipment back in my truck, and these two little boys came up, and they each had a brand new penny, and they said, "Our grandmother just told us that if you give a chimney sweep a penny, it's good luck." So I said, "That's cool," and so it was just, there were so many things about the folklore of sweeps that really floated my boat, and uh, the idea of being a carrier of good luck and sort of like this mysterious power, and there was also a thing where you take a thumbprint, a sooty thumbprint, and put it up on the door jamb. That would bring the whole house good luck for a year until the sweep came back. So I started sweeping in '77, and it wasn't my first thought. I was working for an artist, stretching canvas and framing canvases, and he had a bunch of people on his payroll, and another guy there who was a carpenter. Um, he and I would talk about doing like woodworking together, and we discovered that the one day the painter had woken up and realized that he couldn't not paint. He had so many people on his payroll that he had to paint whether he wanted to or not. And so he told us all we had a week, and we had to find something new to do. So this other guy who was a carpenter had an article from Mother Earth News all about how much money you could make as a chimney sweep. Yeah. Well, anyway, so this seemed like an interesting idea to me. So we thought maybe we'd go into it together, have a company together. But when push came to shove, he decided that he was going to do carpentry, and so I said, "Well, I'm going to do chimney sweeping." So I found out about this school in Williamsburg, Mass. At the time, I was living in New Hampshire, and there was a school, the New England School of Chimney Sweeping, which was basically a guy who was a chimney sweep who realized that he could make even more money by having people pay him to act as a helper for a week. And at the end of the week, he would give them a red scarf and a certificate that said that they had passed the the New England School of Chimney Sweeping. And so I thought I did it, and I'll never forget because I had never put up a ladder before, and so I'm putting up this ladder, and in my head I'm thinking, boy, I really hope I like this, because I just paid him. This was in 1977. I just paid him $650 to teach me how to sweep chimneys, and that was a lot of money to me anyway back then. And so we're going along, and the thing that I learned the most from him and was what not to do. I can remember time after time he would do something, and I think, oh my God, I'm never going to do that. Like he had a vacuum that we were in the middle of doing this one job, and something happened to the vacuum, and it started spewing ashes and soot all over the place. And I thought, you know, oh yeah, yeah. So I thought I got to get a better kind of vacuum. And also he took there was a job where we got there, and it didn't need to be swept, and he just he explained it to the person who owned the house, and they said, well, just go ahead and sweep it anyway. So he went through the motions, and then he took the money, and I thought, you know, this doesn't seem right to me at all. So anyway, I learned a lot of stuff not to do. And after 4 days, it was supposed to be a 5-day course. After 4 days, he said, there's nothing more I can teach you. So you're good. He gave me the certificate. He was out of red scarves. But so I went into town in Northampton, Massachusetts, and there was a company store called Family Jewels. And I got a couple of tailcoats and a top hat and a vest and started working. And even though I really they hadn't taught me a whole lot at the New England School of Chimney Sweeping, I felt like I wasn't experimenting. And this gave me some confidence that I might not otherwise have had, and started sweeping. And it just I was in New Hampshire, I was in the Lakes region, and probably, I don't know, 80% of the households in New Hampshire were heating at least supplementally with wood at the time. And there were terrible losses to chimney fires. So I could wear funny clothes, drive around, and learn about the folklore and history of this profession that I decided I was going to do, and I could help people be safe, while also not using so much oil. And actually, I have one of my old license plates from New Hampshire. This was where my email address comes from, that too, from the no soot. And it was funny because I my first business was called the Chimney Swift. And when I went to get my plate, the vanity plate, as they call them in New Hampshire, I was stunned that nobody who was sweeping chimneys, and there were 4 or 5 in the state at that point, had realized that they could get that as a license number. And so after about a year of sweeping, and I had joined the National Chimney Sweep Guild, and I went to one of their first conventions in Washington, D.C., and it became clear that they were not going to help me out in New Hampshire doing what I was doing. They were just kind of, I don't know, it was a promotional deal for Yodel stoves. And it just seemed like we needed something local. So I helped form the New Hampshire Chimney Sweep Guild. And that was kind of a gas, and just got about it. And I loved what I was doing, and that showed. So I kept on doing it in New Hampshire. And then after had been doing this for about 20 years, probably, there was a woman who was also a Reveley from Texas, and she had gotten involved in investigating the Reveley family genealogy. And she wanted a little biographical paragraph from everybody that she could post on her website. And so I wrote out little things, talking about how I was a chimney sweep, and had been doing it for a bunch of years. And I got emails back from guys in England. Well, I'm a chimney sweep. My grandfather was a chimney sweep. My great grandfather was a chimney sweep back into the 1800s in England. And I had no idea about this when I first started sweeping. So this was kind of a gas. And let's see if I'm going to try doing the share. It's going to be a little bizarre because I don't have a smooth way of doing it. But apparently you can see me and you can hear me, but I can't see the rest of the group while I'm doing it. But I'm going to give it a try here. Let's see if it works. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is a picture from 2015. It's my favorite picture of me as a chimney sweep. Okay, so I'm going to ask, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so this was taken by the person who owned the house, and it was in the winter, probably December of 2015. And this picture was taken in 1982 when I was living in New Hampshire. And it was published in a magazine or a booklet about Squam Lake, which is a lake where a lot of my customers lived around. And when it was my first job of the day, so my face was clean. And I told the photographer to wait a minute, and I patted my face with my gloves, and that's why my face is covered with soot in this, because I felt I wanted some authenticity to the picture. And this was one of my very first sweeping hats, also. Also a beaver. Sorry, Ingrid. And so then in the, it would have been the early 1800s, William Blake wrote a book called The Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. And in the Songs of Innocence, he included a poem about chimney sweeps, the chimney sweeper, and talks about how when he was very young, his mother died and his father sold him to a chimney sweep. And so your chimneys I sweep and in soot I sleep. And then there's another Tom who's sad, and things, become, when Tom dies, the angels come and, everybody's happy and, clean and everything. And it's all rosy and innocent from the Songs of Experience. And then he also wrote a book about, in the Songs of Experience, about a chimney sweeper who now he's a little black thing among the snow, crying, weep, 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 in notes of woe. Where thy father and mother say they are both gone to the church to pray. Because I was happy upon the heath and smiled among the winter's snow, they clothed me in the clothes of death and taught me to sing the notes of woe. And because I am happy and dance and sing, they think they have done me no injury. They are gone to praise God and his priest and king, who make up a heaven of our misery. I really like that. Anyway, and then there's this great book that I got from the 1800s about the London poor and the London laborers, and it shows this guy who is a chimney sweep, and it says one of the few remaining climbing sweeps. Maybe this was at a time when they were beginning to use rods and brushes rather than having to actually climb into the flue and do it from inside. So he might have been a midget in order to get up into the flues. And so this is one of my favorite customers. His name is Ahmad Jamal, and Ahmad Jamal was a fantastic jazz pianist, and he had a house in a nearby town, and I cleaned his chimneys out for a number of years. And he was about 85 when I took this picture, and he died a couple of years later. But he was a pretty great guy, and it shows me in my work attire with my vest, and I used to wear a T-shirt that had a formal jacket and tie, silk screened onto the front. And you can see this is my work hat. It was all sort of bashed up. And so that's how I looked when I worked.
Douglas, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So how did these climbing sweeps manage to could secure themselves as they went up the chimney? Did they, what
They would
was the,
wedge themselves up because it was big, but not too big, so they could, with their arms and legs and their knees and elbows, they had weeping sores basically all the time in their knees and elbows. And they couldn't wear a lot of clothes. They would wear like a loincloth and maybe some shorts or something, because if they got hung up on a projecting piece of masonry, they might get permanently stuck. And so it was really pretty wretched existence. Blake had it right in his Songs of Experience, that they were, because they'd shout out, weep, 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 to get people to hire them as a chimney sweep. And in this country, in the 1800s, there was a law on the books in Philadelphia that if you had a fire in the chimney that blazed out at the top, as they put it, you were fined heavily. The owner of the house would be fined. And so chimney sweeps were a pretty important part of the laboring force in those days. And supposedly in colonial times, they would take a goose and they would tie a cord to its leg, and then they would release it up into the chimney flue they had these huge center chimneys, and the goose would flap its wings and trying to fly out the top. And that was one of the ways they supposedly, anyway, cleaned the chimneys out, because they were so big. Like I've seen in some of the really old houses, center chimneys might have the kitchen flue might be 18 inches by 3 feet easily. So they're just enormous. And the biggest I ever saw was a house in Henniker, New Hampshire, outside Concord. And it was a big old farmhouse with an enormous center chimney that had 8 fireplaces in it. And the main flue was huge, and it had a transitional form of a Dutch oven, the beehive oven. So when they built these chimneys, over to the side of the fireplace was an arched sort of they call them a beehive. It was an arched structure that was set back with a door, and that was a bake oven. So you'd build a fire in the bake oven, and the smoke in these early forms, some of them were all the way back. This one, it was partly toward the front of the fireplace, and the smoke would just spill out the front. And then when you got to the temperature that you needed, you'd put a tin door over the front, and that's how you'd bake bread or whatever. And then by the early 1800s, they had moved the door for the beehive oven out to the front, and it had its own door. It had a cast iron door and its own flue that would go up. And this one house in Henniker had a single piece of granite that was about 10 feet long and probably 10 or 18 inches high. And that was the lintel for the fireplace. So the opening of the fireplace was that wide. And the beehive just smoked out into this huge flue. And they actually were having me put in a liner for a wood stove that they were going to put in that chimney. And up in the attic of this, it was a huge space in the top of this farmhouse, and where the chimney was coming up, there was this little. It was almost like a little swelling. I mean, it was hardly it was hard to describe. It extended out only a few inches from the surface of the chimney, and it was probably less than a foot deep. And there was a little clay hearth, and there were rings in the rafters of the roof where they would hang rods, and they could hang hangings, cloth down, and that would divide the space up. And that's where the hired help was, up in the, for the farmland of this farmhouse. And they had this tiny little fireplace, probably no more than 18 inches high. And that was how they kept warm, I guess, or something. I don't know, it's pretty crazy. Although if all the fireplaces were going down in the main part of the house, the actual brick mass of the chimney was probably warm enough to, if they slept around the outside of the chimney, it would keep them warm. But these, the chimneys in these fireplaces, they could burn many cords of wood a year in these huge fireplaces for the kitchen, and then every bedroom would have a fireplace. So they were from, at least in New Hampshire and the northern New England, from um, late September into May. They'd be burning fires in these fireplaces, uh, and houses would burn down with regularity from chimney fires. And
How often did you in a well-used chimney? How often would it need to be swept?
well, there were actually chimneys that customers that I had that had me do them twice a year, but
Wow.
usually once was enough. And that was with a modern wood stove in it. But a lot of times, especially when in the mid '70s, uh, companies started producing airtight wood stoves, and in the old days they called them airtight, but they weren't really airtight. They were very leaky, so the fires had plenty of air supply, and uh, and so they would burn more cleanly. But with an airtight wood stove, when the air supply was restricted, so you could get a longer burn, the it was also producing more particulates and more sort of tarry droplets. So the smoke was denser, and the smoke was basically atomized, unburned wood. And if you had an old style like a Franklin fireplace or an open fireplace or a loose parlor stove from the old days, it would, you know, every year would be a good idea. But what was happening with people who were burning the airtight wood stoves is they were used to burning um, an old non-airtight wood stove, so they would close them down. Oh, I want to get 14, and they would advertise them. You can get a 14-hour burn or something like that. And this was, they had to stop advertising that way because people would try to get the maximum amount of burn, and it would look like somebody poured tar down the chimney. It would be completely coated with this shiny, tarry residue um, glaze. And if that got burning, you could have temperatures over 2,000 degrees,
Wow.
and with volcanic fire coming out the top with burning globs of this tarry creosote spewing out and landing on roofs. And, it was pretty disastrous. Um, and when I was, anyway, there was a point at which I joined the volunteer fire department in the town where I was living, and they always put me on the roof during chimney fires. They said, "Go on, Reveley, get on the roof." So I was there all the time. So I'd get on the roof and help try and put out these damn fires. And of course, you can't put a hose down the chimney; it'll just destroy the chimney when it's like practically glowing with the temperatures. But they, basically had to wait for the thing to go out. There was actually a process called flaking, which it didn't last long. There were a few of us who tried it. I had one customer who I couldn't seem to get the glaze, that tarry creosote, to stop forming. They were just not using their stove properly, and even twice a year, just couldn't get to it. So I had them call the Plymouth, New Hampshire Fire Department, and the fire department came. They parked a fire truck in the driveway, and I stuffed newspaper through the opening in the chimney, and the fire chief was there, and so he handed me a book of matches and said, "You light it." So the idea was to get it burning, but then to close off the air supply, let it burn a little bit more, close off the air supply, let it burn a little more, close off the air supply. And what happens with with the creosote when it burns is it expands, and it looks like when you're cooking an apple pie or some sort of fruit pie, and a little bit of the juices leak out over the edge and land on the bottom of the oven, and makes this, like, expands in this little carbon sponge. Well, that's the way it is inside of the chimney. Is that all the creosote that's in the chimney starts to expand, and is full of air, and so it'll just keep burning, but eventually it starts to choke things off, and that's when, like, smoke starts to come out of every possible opening in the chimney, and along with some of the heat. So you have to keep opening up this choke point, and that can get pretty crazy. So a lot of times people would say, "Well, I had chimney fire, so it's all clean now, right?" And, well, no, not actually, because people would have a chimney fire, not so bad that it would come shooting out the top, but they'd have a chimney fire and then they'd figure it was all burned out, so they would just keep using it, and all of this tarry creosote would saturate the sponge of old ash, and it would build up, and then they'd have another chimney fire. It was crazy. So tried to get people not to continue using their chimneys after they'd had a chimney fire. Besides which, they could crack the chimney, which was really, really common. And at some point, and I don't know, maybe I'm probably going to go on more than an hour, but I'll see if I can work up some photographs of problem chimneys that I have, where flue tiles are completely out of alignment, and broken with holes, and it gets pretty crazy. But I would get people that would call me. I remember this one old farmer would call me up, and he asked me to come and clean his chimney. And when I got there, he said, "Well, now let me tell you what I did." And if anybody said that to me right away, I knew I was going to have problems, because they did something. They thought they could clean their chimney out, and they did something. I've pulled logging chains, just all kinds of stuff out of chimneys that got stuck. Somebody was using chains on a rope and trying to clean the chimney out, and the rope would break or whatever, and the chains would fall down, but not all the way to the bottom. And so this one farmer, he had tried the chains broke off, got stuck in the chimney. So he decided he was going to use a 2x4 to jam it down in. And, this tarry creosote is gooey and sticky. So every time he would hit it, it would compact it into this solid mass of tar and chains. And then he dropped the 2x4. So when I got there, there was this 2x4 I had to fish out somehow or other, and a whole mass of chain and creosote all stuck in. I had all kinds of tools that I could use, but it was usually you have to come up from the bottom for that. So, it was an adventure almost daily. It was an adventure, and that was one of the things actually that I really enjoyed about it, is that every day I had to solve some new problem that I'd never come across before, and so that kept my mind active. That was, and it made it fun. Besides which, I remember going into a grocery store in Plymouth, New Hampshire, and I always, when I was out working, I always wore my top hat and tailcoat. I mean, I stopped wearing the tailcoats after a while because they would blow around in the breeze, and it kind of got in the way. So I'd stopped doing that. But in those days, I had a tailcoat, top hat, and I was going through this aisle, and this kid, there was a fireman there in his dress uniform. I think he was doing an inspection, and there was this little kid, and he saw the fireman. He was like, "Whoa," because the fireman is all dressed in this spiffy uniform, and he was looking at the fireman. Then he turned around, he saw me, and his mouth just fell open, and he said, "Mom, look at the gentleman." And I thought, no, you got that wrong, but it's okay too. And so it was just fun. It was kids. It was a gas, to be able to provide people with some enjoyment. But
So,
uh,
so Douglas,
yeah,
so we got the mechanics.
yep.
I'm a chimney sweep and I come to a chimney. How do I clean that? How do I get rid of all the creosote?
Okay, so
How's that work?
thank you very much. So there were, well, in that photograph, which I'm not going to show right now, but I'll show later, there was, I'm holding a chimney brush, which in this case was a big one. It was probably about 12 by 16. And the big brushes had very thick flat wires. And the smaller brushes had bristles that were like a brush bristle. But they were also steel bristles. And for a smaller flue, like well, that was one of the other weird things, was that they would call a flue an 8x8 flue, but that was because that's how big they were before masons started lining the chimneys. They had, so you'd have an 8x8 flue, which actually was only 7 inches by 7 inches on the inside. And many a time I would have to extract a homeowner's brush that he'd get because he knew he had an 8x8 flue. So he'd go to the store and buy an 8 inch by 8 inch brush and try and ram it up through this flue, and it would get stuck. And then the bristles were reversed, so he couldn't pull it down. He couldn't get it up anymore. So it was just basically a mess. And so anyway, so I would do it from the roof. There were chimney sweeps who would only do it from the bottom, but that seemed crazy to me because you couldn't see what was wrong with the chimney above the roof. So I'd take my 8 inch brush or my 7 inch brush or my 7 inch by 11 inch brush, which was for an 8x12 flue, and and I'd attach it to fiberglass rods. And I had 5-foot fiberglass rods, and you'd put it down until you were getting some resistance, and then you'd basically scrub the chimney. And I had a job once where it was a house that was being renovated, and so it wasn't occupied at the time, but I had inspected the chimney through an opening in the flue in the kitchen, which had this, we called them pie plates, but it had this sort of it looked like a pie plate. It was a metal covering that would fit over the flue. And when I left the kitchen and went up onto the roof, I forgot to put the pie plate back in the hole in the chimney. So when I came down into the kitchen, there was this swath of soot across the floor of so I had to vacuum that up before anybody could see. And but you'd had to do various things to keep the soot from leaking out of the chimney, and so you just would keep scrubbing until you got down to the brush or to the basement usually, and if it was a fireplace, you could do it from inside, from the bottom. But when I was working in a fireplace, I would with heavy duty duct tape, I'd put sheets over the front of the fireplace, and then I work inside the sheet um, covering, so the ashes and soot wouldn't leak out into the living room. It's always a little daunting to be working in somebody's living room, and then I would wear a hazmat suit and which with a hood and an industrial strength respirator and face mask like goggles or like a welder's mask but clear. And because it'd be working on the inside, and just all this crap would be coming down on top of you, and so it'd get pretty messy.
So
And
Douglas, I'm
yep,
assuming there, as you're working from the top, there's a limit to how far your brush can go. So is that where you, and then also from the bottom, so is that where you have to climb into the flue itself to get, I mean, are
well,
these
fortunately,
brushes?
there were a few flues I could have climbed into, but fortunately, you know, basically, I had 60 feet worth of chimney rods,
Okay,
so I could sweep just about anything I came across. And the so I from from the roof, say was a furnace or a wood stove flue, then that was all that was on it. I put the brush right down to the basement and then pull it up, and all the way down, scrubbing it, and then you'd have to shovel all the stuff out of the bottom. And whenever I was doing something like that, or if I was working in a fireplace, I had a chimney sweeping vacuum that was running all the time to minimize the amount of dust. And only once did I have a problem with dust escaping into the house when I was working, and that was because I hadn't emptied the vacuum for a while, and it was leaking through the exhaust. It was leaking out ash probably, and
Doug,
yeah.
got a question. Did you have a flat rate, or did these complicated homeowner caused problems create a much bigger bill for them?
Yeah, that depended. I usually had a flat rate, so I had a flat rate for a wood stove and a flat rate for a fireplace. A fireplace was more because it took a lot more setup, and it could take a couple of hours to sweep. And then I had a flat rate for inspections. So, like if I came to a house and the chimney didn't need cleaning, I had a partial fee for inspections, and because I would do as thorough inspection as I could. I would go on the roof, and I would go in the basement, and I would use a mirror, and I would take pictures and all that kind of stuff. And uh, but if it didn't need cleaning, I wasn't going to clean it unless they insisted, which I didn't actually have anybody insist. But the um, it was if I had a chimney lining, for instance, that was time and materials, because that could take a day and a half. Because you usually had to remove the original flue tile that was damaged somehow or other, and that meant running a motorized. It was basically a block of steel, a square block of steel on special steel rods, and that would get hooked up to a heavy duty drill, and you'd turn it on and it would flail around on the inside of the flue tiles and smash them up, hopefully in pieces that were small enough to fall all the way to the bottom, which didn't always happen. And the other thing about it was you never knew what you were going to run into. You might have a mason who built this great big enclosure, but ran a 12 by 12 flue up into it, and then left an open space around it. So you might have start out at the usually I would remove the top flue tile so I could see what was going around the outside, because if you started at the bottom, the whole thing might collapse, and then you'd have a whole other set of problems. And although I did have that happen in an inn in Waterville Valley, the Snowy Owl Inn, they'd had a chimney fire, and when I was up into the, as far as the attic, everything started to shift, and I'd reached a broken flue tile with my chimney rods, and it all fell apart and trapped. It trapped my chimney brush, so I was stuck, and chunks of chimney tile were coming down from like 25, 30 feet up into the fireplace. And so I had to go up into the attic and knock a hole in the side of the chimney so that I could loosen everything up. And when I did that, all of the debris fell down into the fireplace with quite a lot of noise. And so things like that would happen. You just could never tell what was going on until you started working on it. And that in itself could be an adventure. And also the things changed a lot. You know, they first of all, they started out with rigid stainless steel pipe in maybe 3-foot sections. So you'd have to rig up a way to lower this gradually growing column of stainless steel pipe. And you'd have to attach at the top with screws, because people were using stainless steel rivets, but with the expansion and contraction over time, the expansion and contraction would sever the rivets, and so things would start to come apart. So by using the screws, it held together better. And so you'd have to screw it at the top and add it piece by piece, and it might be 35, 40 feet long. So that was an adventure. And then after some time, they came up with flexible stainless steel liners, and they were really very flexible. They'd come out of the truck, the delivery truck, as a coil, and so you'd take that coil to the customer's house and open it up, and it might, you'd lay it out, might be 30 or 40 feet. And but that way you could they were light enough, some of them were light enough that you could haul it up onto the chimney with a helper and feed it down the chimney, and then hook it up with tees or whatever you needed to do to hook it up to the wood stove or the wood boiler. And I did one for a fireplace that was 12-inch round in a condo in a ski area up in New Hampshire, and that was pretty interesting. And then what we would do is you had a bunch of choices for insulation. I would, in the latter days, I would wrap a ceramic fiber blanket around the outside of the stainless steel liner, and that ceramic fiber could take temperatures over 2,000 degrees. So it was pretty great. It had an aluminized layer on the outside to protect it, and then that would get sleeved with a special mesh tube of stainless steel mesh, and that whole assembly would go down the chimney. And it was the other option was to actually mix up a refractory mix that would then get poured down around the outside of the flue. And I did that with the one that I did in the condominium. And I had a guy helping me who looked like he came out of Braveheart or something. He was this big Scottish looking guy, big guy, long red hair and red beard. And he was helping me do this. And then we were carrying buckets of this mix. And this was like a 3-story condo with this ridiculously long roof and a chimney that was about 13 or 14 feet off the roof. So I had to put a ladder on the ridge of the roof and lean it up against the chimney. And it was almost like suicidal, but you had to get up to the top of the chimney somehow. So he was going up behind me, and I've got two buckets in one hand. And he at one point he said, "You do this all day long?" And it was like, yeah, it's what you got to do. So uh, it, um, it kind of gets you into good shape doing all this kind of stuff. But pouring the stuff around the outside meant that it was a permanent fixture with the insulating blanket. You could, if something went wrong, you could pull it out. Because in the early days when they were using not as high grade a stainless steel, somebody could have a chimney fire in that, and then you'd have to pull it because it would wreck the stainless steel. The temperatures would get so high. And the insulated metal chimneys, like Metal Best, which is a brand that became, a name for that kind of chimney. But insulated metal chimneys, if you had a really serious chimney fire in one of those, it would destroy the inside layer of the line of the chimney, and so you'd have to replace the entire thing, which was interesting in itself. But that, those were sort of the basics. Sweeping chimneys, and I started doing tuck pointing also, which was fun. I really enjoyed doing the tuck pointing because it was almost a form of art, especially when a lot of the chimneys that I worked on were very old, and so they didn't want them. I couldn't take a grinder with a 1/4-inch blade and just grind out all the masonry from the joints, because that would make it totally uniform, look like it had been built last week. But when the masons built these old chimneys, these huge old chimneys, there was a lot of variation in the width. And so I got pneumatic stone carving chisels with various widths of the chisel points, and to get out the mortar from between the bricks in various widths. And then I found a company out of Chicago that had their mortar mixes were based on the age of the chimney. So you couldn't put a modern mortar into a chimney that was from the early 1800s or even the 1700s, because the mortar would be harder than the brick. And as the chimney aged and as moisture came in and out of the chimney, that hard mortar would force the bricks to do the breathing, and then the bricks would break down and fall out, and it'd have a worse problem than when you started. But this age-specific mortar would breathe instead of making the brick do the breathing. So that was pretty cool.
So was masonry typically part of the job? I mean, that you had to
No, especially when I started. I mean, I didn't even do chimney linings when I started. I just swept chimneys. And I know there are guys now who still just sweep chimneys. But when I moved to Massachusetts and had to change the name of my business, I called it Blue Moon Chimney Service. So I figured, if you're gonna, in New Hampshire it was called the chimney swift, which is a bird that nests in chimneys. And if you're going to call yourself a chimney service, you can't just do chimney sweeping. I would work with a mason who would build chimneys, because I didn't want to do that. And I would rebuild a chimney if it wasn't very big. But mostly it was tuck pointing, and I would replace crowns, which is the mortar on the very top of the chimney that sheds water, supposedly. And
what is tuck pointing?
okay, tuck pointing is where you remove the old masonry, and then you use a special tuck pointing trowel, which is very narrow, and you put the new mortar into that old joint that you've cleaned out. And you have to get just the right amount of depth. And because if you don't get it deep enough, and if you just keep using the same old grinder blade, it gradually wears out, so that it's not a square. The back of the joint doesn't have a square surface, and it has a rounded surface, and the mortar will just come right out and just pop out if you don't do it right. And it just, to me, it was, if you're not going to do it right, then go home. It's like, don't do it. And so I really enjoyed doing the pointing and crown repairs and the chimney lining. I did a lot of chimney linings over the years. And I remember, well, I'll tell one more story, and then Tony, if we're good, I can find some more images and talk again on Thursday. And so I had this one job where it was in the town where I lived, and they had another sweep do a lining, and they wanted me to check everything out and clean the chimney. So I walked into the kitchen, and I immediately, I just turned around and walked out, and I said, "There's this situation is very hazardous." So they had a wood burning cook stove in the kitchen, and the stovepipe went up, and it had a 90-degree elbow and then went into the chimney. But it was only it was less than 12 inches from the ceiling. And you're supposed to have a minimum of 18 inches clearance to any combustibles with a with a stovepipe. So not only was it in the ceiling where it was going to have the heat was going to rise into the ceiling, it was too close. So you could have a fire. And so I explained that, and they said, well, take a look at the fire at the wood stove. So I went around into the living room, and this was so crazy that the chimney was in the kitchen. The wood stove was in the living room, it had a 3 or 4 foot space. It's probably more like 4 or 5 foot space between the wall where the wood stove was plugged into supposedly into the chimney, and where the chimney was. It was like, what? So in this underneath the stairway, in contact with the plaster and lath ceiling of this sloping stairway, was this horizontal brick flue, and that went out to the wall of the wood of the living room. So I went around there, and the chimney sweep had put up a heat shield, and he used a metal, just a single sheet of metal, which you can do, but you have to have an airspace between. So you have to have a 1-inch airspace with spacers, so that when the air behind the metal heats up, it flows out and gets replaced by cooler air. So you get this constant airflow. Well, he had screwed it right to the wall. So the heat would conduct right through the metal sheet into the wall. And the wall was made of, I don't know if you know what beaver board is, but before they had plasterboard, they had beaver board, and beaver board was just compressed sawdust, basically. And I went to a school that was built out of beaver board and burned one Thanksgiving when a disgruntled student set fire to the place, and it burned with an intense fire. So here's this wood stove, maybe 12 to 18 inches away from the wall, with nothing really protecting it, just this metal sheet that was in contact with the wall. And the wall's made of this ridiculously flammable material. So I said, you really should have this guy come back and fix things. And they said, no, we don't want him anywhere near the house. So my helper and I We took down the heat shield from the fireplace. We took down the pipe, or from the wood stove. We took down the pipe. That horizontal section was completely glazed with tar creosote. So if that had burned, it would have caught fire in the stairwell. And then so we're pulling down the wall, plaster, this lath wall, and I'm in the kitchen, and my helper said, "Doug, you got to come and look at this." So I went in, and with a flashlight, we looked into this space behind the wall. It's a great big open space because of this separation between the living room and the kitchen due to the fireplace. And when he had, I don't know why, but there are a whole bunch of bricks out of the chimney. They're just lying on the floor. And what he did was he took, I think that happened when he was doing the lining. And he had used some fiberglass insulation and stuffed the hole with this fiberglass insulation. So now the fiberglass was saturated with creosote, and fiberglass insulation melts at about 600 degrees. So a lot of times I would see fireplaces where the wood stoves have been installed and they'd seal off the fireplace opening with fiberglass, and there'd be holes that would be melted through by falling burning creosote. So if this house had had a chimney fire, it would have melted out this fiberglass, and then there was just nothing. It would have been burning creosote falling down into this inaccessible space and would burn the house down. So, but by this time I'm videotaping everything, and because I wanted this all had to be documented. So the previous sweep had lowered flue tiles down on a rope to reline the chimney. Instead of putting a stainless steel liner in, he used flue tiles and just kind of stacked them up on top of each other, but they were slightly misaligned, and it was just a nightmare. And so I removed all those flue tile, put in a stainless liner. I put a stainless liner in the horizontal section, and everything was, and re-bricked the hole in the chimney, and basically saved their house probably. So it was that kind of thing that was the sort of thing that would really float my boat. Somebody might have, the kid's room was above where the cook stove chimney pipe was going in. So if they'd had a fire, people could have died if they'd had it at night. So that was the kind of thing that really was fulfilling about what I was doing.
Douglas, I think it's quite revealing and shows your, that this was the right occupation for you. That a bunch of times during this hour, you describe something as interesting, and I would have thought that it would be disturbing or unnerving or maddening, disheartening, but you said interesting, so.
Yeah, well, it was interesting. Sometimes it was all those other things too, but it was always interesting. So
What about fear of height? Did you have any fear of height?
I had this chimney that was on a 3-story Victorian house with a very steep slate roof, and not only that, but when you would stand on the ridge of the roof, the chimney was taller than I was, so I had to have a small ladder that I built out of 2x4s. And I have this little, and painted it black, and it had this little ladder that I'd put up on the ridge to lean up against the. So I bought a climbing harness for that job in particular. But somebody was talking to me, said, "It's a good thing that you're not afraid of heights." I said, "Well, it's under control." Because when I did that particular house, I did it 3 years. And I was scared the whole time I was working. So by the time I was done, I was exhausted. And so after the first year, the second 2 times I did that house, that was the only job I did that day. Because not only that, but there were 2 chimneys I had to clean. So I had to finish up one. Then I had to go along the ridge of the roof with my little ladder, and it's all slate. So if you make a wrong step, you could break a slate, and you're gone. So I would just, that was the only job I would do that day. I would go home.
Well, this has been great. This has been great, Douglas, and it's been a privilege to be right next to two of my favorite sponsees.
That's right.
I think we met on the we met on the first day of school at Pomona.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, this is just the very definition of old school craftsmanship. I have really enjoyed it, and probably was way more interesting than it had any reason to be. But you've got more stuff for us, huh?
Oh, sure. I have a whole bunch of images that I took of problem chimneys, and I have a lot of other, stuff to shoot the shit about.
Great.
Well, let's meet again on Thursday. We'll record this, and or it's been recorded, and I'll post it, and then we'll meet again on Thursday and continue.
Sounds good to me.
Good.
Douglas, thank you. This has been just fascinating.
Well, it's fun for me
Very interesting.
Too. I mean, I still get calls from people that are looking for chimney work, and I refer them to somebody else. But I say, well, tell me what's going on. If there's a problem, and so we'll troubleshoot while they're on the phone. And I said, look, if you have any issues, if you can't get a hold of the guy, or if you feel like maybe you're not getting the right information, or you just want more information, call me back and we'll talk it over again.
Very cool.
Yeah.
All right, guys. We will see you
very much
on Thursday.
Well done.